Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History. In this amazing collaboration episode with the Age of Napoleon podcast, Everett Rummage and I have a wide ranging discussion on all things Napoleon in the lead up to the Federalist revolts. Amongst other topics, we cover a young Napoleon, his formative years, his time in Corsica, and his first real battle. We also explore the social and political divides which shaped not only his early 20s, but the French Revolution as a whole. This is a fantastic joint episode with the Age of Napoleon, and I think it sets the scene perfectly for Napoleon's upcoming debut in Grey History as we approach the Siege of Toulon. If you're interested in another great long-form history podcast, one that's focused on events after the French Republic, do make sure to check out The Age of Napoleon wherever you get your podcasts. It's one of my personal favourite shows, and I'm sure you'll absolutely love it. Of course, before we get into it, a quick thank you to the members that make all of this possible. Furthermore, as we discuss Corsican politics in revolutionary France, don't forget that all members have access to 2 bonus episodes on the Corsican Revolution, amongst a whole host of other perks. Those members on the True Revolutionary tier already have early access to episode 70, Toulon, the Flimsy Coalition, and the Second Petition of Poland. As this is not a main episode, I'll save the introductions of new members for next week. But in the meantime, thank you to everyone who has been supporting the show in some way, shape, or form. Your sponsorship of Grey History is what makes all of this possible. Anyway, that's enough from me, so let's get into it. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special collaboration episode between Grey History, the French Revolution, and the Age of Napoleon. My name is Will Clark, and I'm the host of Grey History, the French Revolution, and joining me today is Everett Rummage of the Age of Napoleon. Everett, it's a pleasure having you here. How are you going?
I'm doing great. I've been looking forward to this. Thank you for setting it up.
No problem at all. I mean, obviously, listeners don't know this, but we've been discussing potential collaborations for a little while now. I mean, obviously, our 2 areas of expertise just have so much overlap. And it just so happens that Grey History is rapidly approaching the Siege of Toulon. And, we're currently doing deep dives into the various centers of the Federalist revolts. And so this presented the perfect opportunity for my listeners to learn more about a younger Napoleon, as well as the various kind of social and political tensions that he was experiencing firsthand. And I suppose for your listeners, it also provided a great opportunity to explore the rifts and divisions in French society, which of course not only defines so much of the Republican era, but indeed leaves a legacy that Napoleon would grapple with throughout his reign. So I know we've got quite a broad agenda, and I don't think either of us are quite sure where we're going to end up. But perhaps to kick us off, do you want to maybe paint a picture for the benefit of my listeners of what Napoleon is up to in the lead up to the Federalist revolts? I mean, where is he in terms of location and his career, and what's the situation like back in his native home of Corsica?
Sure. So Napoleon is a totally unknown at this point junior officer in the French army. He was actually in Paris for some of the more dramatic period just before the revolution. But in this period we're talking about now, he is back in Corsica. And Corsica is a somewhat unique part of France in that it hasn't been French for very long. It became part of France in 1769, the year Napoleon was born, actually. So, this stage in our story, there are a lot of people who remember the days before the French. And there's very much a sense that the Corsican people are not the same as the French people, to put it simply. That there is a cultural, political, all kinds of divides between the mainland and Corsica. And that legacy of independence and that regional identity shaped the politics in this era. So in the rest of France, you've got politics polarizing between two opposing forces, the revolution and the counter-revolution. In Corsica, there's actually a third force, which is the pro-independence. They called themselves the Patriots. Of course, the French supporting revolutionaries had a very different definition of patriot. But at this point, the great leader of the formerly independent Corsican Republic, Pasquale Paoli, is back on the island, and he had been in exile. He'd been charged with crimes for resisting the French occupation when they arrived on the island, and Paoli has been welcomed back by the population with open arms. He was incredibly popular during his time in office, idolized by generations of Corsicans, including Napoleon Bonaparte and his family. The Bonapartes had played a very important role, actually, in Paoli's independent republic. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, had been his secretary. So Napoleon is back in this sort of three-way political tug of war. There are pro-French, pro-government, pro-revolution factions in Corsica. There are these pro-independence forces that I've mentioned. And then there are also, still at this stage, the remnants of the royal administration, who are generally hostile to the revolution and conservative, but also pro-French. They're not interested in this autonomy or independence from the central government. So, echoes of what's going on in the mainland, but with a unique Corsican spin on things.
Do you have a situation? I mean, I'm cautious at where Napoleon's allegiance lies between these three camps at the moment, because I can imagine that it's not necessarily strictly only in one column. But to expand on that question as well, do you have a situation where there are other individuals that take a little bit from column A and a little bit from column B? Take, for example, the role of, say, the clergy on the island. Would they have perhaps some sympathies towards the royal administration? And, well, maybe it's sympathies just with anything that's not the revolutionary administration that has imposed some pretty controversial reforms upon them against their will.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Especially early in this period, people's loyalties are very divided, and the lines between the different factions are not very clear. For instance, Paoli, during his time in office, had been sort of a ideologically flexible, let's put it that way. And he had borrowed heavily from the at that time left wing traditions of the Enlightenment, but he also it had a lot of conservative elements to his rule. He'd been a all his life a devout Catholic, and had during his first tenure in office in Corsica when it was independent, had not really seen a contradiction between those Enlightenment views and the church. And so early, as I said, he was a essentially universally admired figure in Corsica. Everyone on the political spectrum idolized Paoli. And that admiration and that, I mean, he was a legend. This is almost like, Robin Hood has returned to England or something. But then once he's invested with power and actually has to start making political decisions, people suddenly find, politics means disappointing people. And Paoli had to make choices about, who he was going to disappoint. And so during this period, you see that, as the polarization that you've been discussing on your show is taking place in France, there's a similar process going on in Corsica, where these three factions are sort of becoming more antagonistic towards one another, more clearly defined. People are picking sides and are becoming more sort of ideologically coherent. So people are sort of sorting themselves into these different camps based not only on personal connections, clan connections, which are very important in Corsican society, but also on their beliefs about politics. Left wingers are moving into the pro French, pro government camp. Right wingers are moving closer to the administration, even if they maybe a few years earlier they would have found that ridiculous, the idea of Corsicans rallying around the royal administration. And then, of course, many are throwing in with Paoli and are, seeing, okay, maybe he's not, a legend. He's just a politician, but he's our politician, and he's who we're going to follow.
And you mentioned that Napoleon's family had been long supporters of Paoli and the movement for independence in the years prior to the revolution, or the decades prior to the revolution, when Corsica was first annexed. Obviously, we know which side Napoleon ends up choosing, but at this point in time, how is he feeling? What is his hopes and dreams for Corsica and the revolution, and how does he? What's the process where him and presumably his family end up finding themselves more firmly in the pro-French, pro-revolutionary camp?
Well, it's something that happens gradually that we only get kind of glimpses of. And, in his, before the revolution, in his youth, Napoleon was actually very anti French. You look at what he was writing, things he was saying as a very young man. He detested the French occupation and saw himself as a Corsican patriot. But the revolution starts to shift his thinking. There were a lot of things that he associated with France, negative things, reasons that he detested the French. And he increasingly starts to see those as things he detested about the royal government, that maybe France itself has a lot to offer, but it was this, the problems came from this inefficient, incompetent, of conservative, backwards government. So you see in this period this transformation within him, where he is increasingly, he's talking about, he's using the same terms, but he's increasingly talking about the conservatives, the nobility, the royal government, rather than France itself. And he's increasingly coming around to the view that he can square his Corsican patriotic beliefs with these new ideas that are coming to the fore in the revolutionary government. That there's sort of maybe a happy median between, maybe some kind of Corsican autonomy under French influence, or maybe, Corsica achieving some kind of cultural and political renaissance, but remaining under the status quo under French rule. So over time, he would continue to evolve and would sort of jettison those last vestiges of that Corsican patriot identity. But for years, in this period we'll be talking about, he sees himself as sort of a moderate pro French Corsican patriot.
So obviously, Napoleon was starting to see a way that he could bridge these kind of previously conflicting ideals that he had in terms of Corsica's place and prosperity within France. Paoli, however, and others, as the revolution progresses, come to very different conclusions given Corsica's trajectory, particularly in the early 1790s. Do you want to maybe elaborate on just what was driving Corsican politics a little bit and Paoli's decisions vis-a-vis Paris and the reforms that were occurring there?
Yeah, so very quickly it becomes clear that although Paoli is this sort of Enlightenment hero, and the radicals in Paris are also very much acolytes of the Enlightenment, it becomes very clear that they have extremely divergent ideas about how to actually put those ideas into practice. Paoli is never on board with the revolution's attacks on the church. He's a Catholic, has always been a Catholic, always will be a Catholic, and so he sort of drags his heels on this. There's increasingly, with any of these political conflicts, there's always a personal element. And Paoli quickly comes to be embroiled in this rivalry with a man named Antoine Christophe Salicetti, who is a lawyer, a Corsican lawyer, who's been elected to the assembly in Paris and is a sort of powerful backroom operator in the Paris government. And as he is increasingly flexing his political muscles in Corsica, there's not space for two people like that on a small island. And so him and Paoli very quickly become rivals. And so these ideological conflicts between the more radical Paris government and these sort of moderate patriotic Corsican factions led by Paoli also have this personal dynamic of the rivalry between Salicetti and Paoli. Meanwhile, all through this, Bonaparte and his brothers, Lucien and Joseph, are trying to sort of launch the family's political prospects on the island. And as I mentioned, they all three of them absolutely idolized Paoli. I mean, they had been raised on stories of his fights in the wars of independence and his, doomed resistance to the French. And Paoli never warmed to them. Their dream was to have him sort of bless their political ambitions. But, he very quickly, they were very young and ideologically sort of not in his camp. And, he at this point is an old man who has spent a lot of his life in exile, very wily figure, as I mentioned, ideologically flexible, whereas the Bonapartes are extremely idealistic, wear their hearts on their sleeves. It's not a good fit. And so there's this period where they're trying to court Paoli and he's just not receptive. And this is going on at the exact same time as the political gulf is widening on the island. So they keep doggedly trying to get Paoli's approval, but that is becoming more and more unlikely, I should say, because of the political developments on the island and back in Paris. Because as the revolution grows more radical, Paoli becomes even more discontented with it. And so, by 1792, especially later in 1792, the revolutionary government is sort of giving Paoli loyalty tests. There's sort of a parliamentary legal warfare between the factions where, Salicetti is using his power to launch investigations of Paoli's partisans, and Paoli is using his power to do the same to Salicetti and his partisans. And it's getting uglier and uglier. And, it's interesting. No one ever wants to be the first person to really cross that Rubicon into violence. And so you get this increasing, tempo of provocations, but no one is willing to actually draw blood.
And so obviously things in Corsica do head pretty south fairly quickly. So what is it that, what's to use another well-used metaphor, what is it that's the straw that breaks the camel's back?
Well, there's sort of two things going on simultaneously. I mentioned that Paris was sort of imposing these loyalty tests on Paoli. So sort of asking him to do things that were not necessarily in his interest and seeing if he went along. And one of these things is what's called the La Maddalena expedition, where they order him to, the country is at war. The War of the First Coalition has broken out by this point, and there's enemy territory right across the straits in Sardinia. And they ask Paoli to use the Corsican National Guard, who, by the way, Napoleon Bonaparte was a lieutenant colonel in the Corsican National Guard. He's ordered to invade Sardinia with the Corsican National Guard. And he does this, but the expedition is a total farce. And it's pretty clear that the commander of the expedition, who, by the way, is a member of Paoli's family and one of his close confidants, it's clear that the commander does not have his foot on the gas all the way, to say the least. They kind of sail around this harbor they're supposed to attack and don't really do much. The only person who's actually really trying to win the battle, it seems, is Napoleon, his first real battle, by the way. And so when the expedition, no surprise, fails, Salicetti launches an inquiry into what happened, and there are accusations that not only was the expedition sort of deliberately spoiled by a person very close to Paoli, but that the enemy might have been tipped off that there was an attack coming. So serious accusations. Officers who served on the expedition make testimonies to Paris that there was treachery, including Napoleon. He writes one of these. He denounces his own, his the man his father served, who was his childhood idol. He actually, writes a poison letter denouncing him to the Paris government. And then at almost the same time this crisis is going on, the former King Louis is executed, which inflames conservative opinion and is seen by practically everyone as a very radical step undertaken by the revolutionaries. So with all these events coming to a head, Paoli basically launches what scholars call an auto coup. So he launches a coup against the government that he's in charge of using his own forces. They occupy strategic locations throughout Corsica, and the remaining pro-French forces on the island try to resist them, and it is civil war, which sadly for the Bonapartes is very quickly won by the pro-Paoli forces.
It's fascinating that the divisions that erupt between former allies and political opponents and the like in such speed during the revolutionary era. One of the aspects that I think will be familiar for my listeners in hearing that ill fated expedition to Sardinia would be the conflict and tension within the various revolutionary institutions, and in this case, in particular, in the army, this tension between fellow officers in many cases and suspected loyalties and the like. Are you able to maybe elaborate on Napoleon's experience of that in the initial years of the revolution, maybe particularly in regards to things like noble emigration and the like? I mean, obviously, this is such a defining aspect of the Revolutionary Army in the initial years of the revolution, and provides so much opportunity for those talented officers who were willing to fight for the young republic.
Yeah, that's in a sense, Napoleon was somewhat unusual in that he was an officer before the revolution and he was an officer after the revolution. Different scholars have different counts of this, but probably a majority of people who were French army officers before the revolution left the army at some point before the natural end of their careers, shall we say. That's really, I mean, think about that, 50%. And it's actually worse than it sounds because the rates of desertion are different for different ranks. So, for instance, generals are much likelier to desert than lieutenants. So, the senior leadership is completely decimated. There are a fair number of junior officers who stick around, but this is a crisis for the French military. I think it's hard to understate what a severe problem this caused to the revolutionary armies in those early years. Uh, as you mentioned, it's also an opportunity for the cream to rise to the top, but that process took a lot of time. And so there was this period where not only is the French army just in desperation looking for leadership, they're trying to expand the military during this time. So they actually don't need to just replace these officers. They need massively more officers than they'd had before the revolution. That's what you get, for instance. I'm sure you'll talk about him in more detail later, but a man like General Carteau, who is a professional painter leading an army. He's a person who had been a junior officer as a very young man, and actually he was weirdly one of the last people to ever paint a portrait of King Louis before he was executed. And now he's leading troops in battle and actually not doing a terrible job, amazingly. But this is a profound crisis, and it actually extends into the war itself. During the war, you actually have officers, in some cases, leading their troops over to the other side in battles, which is, it's hard to imagine a worse catastrophe on a battlefield than your own troops going over to fight for the enemy.
No, it's absolutely shocking. I mean, where we are in grey history, we've seen some high profile defections already in terms of Lafayette and Du Maurier. But as you say, the sheer size of emigration from the military ranks, not just the army, but the navy as well. I mean, the fleet in Toulon, for example, you're looking at about half the officers there refused to re-enlist within the first few years of the revolution. So this is something that cripples the French armed services. And as you point out, they actually need more officers than they started with at the start of the revolution, because, of course, within the first few months of 1793, with the exception of Russia, they're at war with every other great power in Europe and then several of the smaller states as well. And so this is, no small threat. And as you say, they needed time for these junior officers to become experienced, to prove themselves, to sort out who can talk a good game politically, but actually who should be in command on the battlefield. And time was not something that the revolutionaries had a lot of. And so they were very lucky to be able to come out as well as they did by the tail end of 1793 and into 1794.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Navy, and that's something important to keep in mind with these defections is that, you know, when I say 50% of the officers, leaving the army, you might be tempted to think of that as, just an equal share, half and half. But actually, there's a huge diversity. Cavalry officers are by far much more likely to desert than infantry officers, who are far more likely to desert than artillery officers or engineer officers. The Navy has similar problems where the captains are all quitting, and it's sort of the more technical and not leadership officers who tend to stay. So these defections are hitting different parts of the army differently. Um, for instance, the artillery officers, they maintain a pretty good cadre, but the cavalry would not recover for years. I mean, even in Napoleon's first Italian campaign in 1796, the cavalry is still lagging far behind the other branches of the service. And the Navy arguably never recovered from this, just because it's so becoming a naval officer is a much longer and more sort of technically demanding process than becoming an army officer. So there's, you could really, I mean, I'm trying to restrain myself because you can really, the devastation wrought on the French military by emigration is really profound, and there's a lot of dimensions to it.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more, in particular with what you were saying about the Navy. I think there's at times a tendency to count the number of ships that a fleet might have when you're looking at comparing particular navies at the time. And the skill and seamanship of the personnel was absolutely critical. This is one of the key things that the British had as an advantage, in addition to the size of their fleet. But I mean, when conflict breaks out in 1793, the actual number of ships that they can crew is not anywhere near as the kind of legend of British naval supremacy might indicate. And it's this skilled and experienced seamanship which really gives the British a leg up and really is detrimental to the French fleets. And also, it must be said, a few years later, once they're allies, the Spanish fleet as well.
Yeah, and it's even, one thing I found fascinating, which I was not aware of before I started doing the show. British shipbuilding was considered to be kind of lagging behind the other powers. So they're, just on the pure technical skill of creating warships, a lot of people seem convinced that the French and the Spanish and maybe even the Americans had them surpassed. But the British, you know, know what they're doing so much better that it doesn't matter. By the end of this period, You know, they've captured a good many of those powerful French and Spanish ships and crewed them with these incredible British crews. So yeah, you're absolutely right that the numbers do not tell the story in naval combat of this era. Of course, there was also a lot of emigration that was had nothing to do with the military. Could you possibly touch on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I suppose for those people that don't know, emigration is one of the most fascinating stories or quite interesting stories of the French Revolution, and it constitutes a lot of firsts. And there are some historians that would even argue that this is the first instance of political emigration on a European scale. In terms of numbers, you're looking at maybe 100 to 150,000 people emigrating from France during this period of time. The majority were actually commoners. They were members of the Third Estate. About 17% were nobles and 25% were clergy, and then just under 60% were commoners. But obviously, you need to take all these figures with a grain of salt. Interestingly, though, if you then look at as a proportion of the estate that emigrated, that tells a very different story again. And you're looking at about a quarter of the clergy emigrating, and they were by far the most likely of the estates to leave France, about 10% for the nobility, and you're looking at an absolute rounding error for commoners, not even half a percent. And even that figure, you could be argued, is inflated due to short term displacements with the Revolutionary War, in particular along the regions that bordered the Rhineland. So, in some ways, the story of emigration is a story that kind of needs to be looked at by the particular estates. But even within those estates, you'll see many different motivations and circumstances and destinations for these groups. And so, other than the fact that there was a significant amount of political immigration during the revolution, it's actually quite non homogenous. And so, you do kind of need to go look at the individual stories to get a good sense of what was happening outside of just that emigration in the armed services.
Can you talk a bit about how it's interesting? That was exactly what struck me when I was researching this part of the story. Is that you really there's kind of a popular image of who the emigres were, but really you have to look at it at an individual level because there's a million different circumstances that led people to make that decision. I was wondering if you could talk at all about how these people were received in their temporary new homes.
Yeah, so it really varied by destination. And I suppose it is worth saying that actually the destination of choice for emigres changed over time as well. I mean, originally it was really the nobility that led the emigration, and they were doing so essentially voluntarily. In the initial years of the revolution, when nobles were departing France, they weren't doing so because they felt that their personal safety was threatened if they didn't, and so they might be going to, say, the western regions of the Holy Roman Empire or Switzerland and the like. Historian Edward Gibbon of ancient Rome fame, he was actually living near Lake Geneva in the autumn of 1789, and so he records this inundation of strangers that arrives from France. But that original wave of the nobility was generally well received. There were some members of the Holy Roman Empire, I think the Prince Bishop of Munster, he actually thought that the emigres were great because their presence would help to foster a hostility towards revolutionary ideals within his own population. But over time, things started to shift, particularly as the emigres composition changed. So as you start to get, say, constitutional monarchists arriving rather than ultra royalists, all of a sudden some of these courts are a bit more suspicious of these individuals and the ideas that they might bring. You have instances, for example, of in Russia, in St. Petersburg, of almost kind of loyalty and ideological tests being applied to these emigres to make sure that they're not bringing in too dangerous an idea. I suppose one society that was particularly welcoming was Great Britain. And actually, while not the kind of destination of first choice initially, by 1792, Britain really is the destination of choice for many emigres, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, in the tail end of 1792, you get significant victories from the now Republican armies. under de Maurier, you see the Austrian Netherlands or modern day Belgium fall to the Republicans. There's also victories in the Rhineland against an emigre army as well, or emigre forces that are working with the Prussians and Austrians. And so this naturally displaces a lot of emigres that had been in these regions of the Holy Roman Empire. But more importantly, who is emigrating is also changing by this point in time. Clerics, so clergymen and clergywomen, didn't necessarily have reasons to migrate in the initial years of the revolution, but by the fall of the monarchy and the September massacres that follow, they do have reasons to leave. And so if you look at Great Britain at its high point in 1792, there's perhaps 20 to 25,000 emigres there. More than 7,000 of those belong to the clergy. And about half of that, believe it or not, are actually on the Channel Island of Jersey. And that's because for priests in Normandy and Brittany in particular, getting to the Channel Islands is a much more achievable task. And actually, if you look at Great Britain's response, you would see something very modern. And what happens is that the civil society in Britain essentially creates charities to help the impoverished French emigres, both clerical emigres as well as the lay population. And you could argue that this is one of the first instances of modern campaigns for humanitarian assistance that we would be very familiar with today in the 21st century. And for some historians, it becomes clear that the most influential and most respected members of the British aristocracy are really making a show of giving generous support to these French refugees. And that's very different from, say, the situation in Austria or Prussia, where generally emigres being allowed to reside there on a long-term basis, that was generally predicated on them being able to provide, for their own subsistence. So that's a long response, but it varied from society to society. But it is, I think, particularly worth noting just how many emigres went to Great Britain and the response that they got there, because it does define. It would be very familiar to us in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always was struck in my research how often you see Koblenz in the German Rhineland referred to, almost just as a shorthand. Some conservative speaks out against the revolution. People might say, "Oh, why don't you go to Koblenz then?" Because that's just understood that that's where you go in that period if you're an emigre. That, of course, that changed a bit when Koblenz was overrun by the French, by the Republicans, I should say. But I was wondering if you could talk about the influence that the all this immigration had in France, because obviously, people are arriving in these new societies, but they're also, their absence is having an impact in the places they've left.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose it very much impacts different parts of France differently, unsurprisingly. And it also depended on who was leaving. I suppose one thing that was kind of common across the country, I think most people don't necessarily appreciate in the French Revolution just how much that this was a time that was defined by a culture of conspiracy and suspicion. There was a plot lurking in every shadow, and the absence and the willingness to depart of so many members of the First and Second Estates really reinforced this suspicion that would be part of the reason why the convention would be paralyzed by factional infighting. So that's something that you see, responses to aristocratic plots and counter-revolution that's lurking in the shadows. I think, obviously, emigration plays into that considerably, and that is a significant part of the story of why the revolution becomes, what it becomes and how it transforms from this revolution of hope and universal brotherhood and sisterhood into something far darker. Certain economies and certain societies, or certain communities, I should say, they feel immigration quite differently. One example to point out would be, say, the city of Lyon, which was the second largest city in France at the time. Lyon was dependent on the silk trade. About a third of its population was employed directly or indirectly due to the silk industry. And silk is a luxury commodity. And so you need the aristocracy, not only the French aristocracy, but foreign courts as well, to be buyers of these goods. And so when you see that market dry up and you've got an economy that's essentially dependent on a single luxury export, the result is, well, mass unemployment and then all the various social problems that come with that. So that's a very specific example to try to paint a more detailed picture of a particular situation. But across the board, I would say that there were many kind of luxury industries that were hit. So those are just two ways that this emigration kind of was felt on the ground, both in a political sense as well as in an economic sense.
Yeah, and I know that in Paris, part of the economic woes of this period were all the people who used to work at the city residence of various nobles, stable hands and maids and cooks and whatnot, who suddenly had no jobs because there were no aristocrats keeping keeping their nice city homes.
Yeah, and that's actually some of the emigres that are members of the third estate were these domestic servants or roles quite similar that actually emigrated with the nobility, for, well, either with those that they were employed by, or they actually just left France in search of work elsewhere because their profession was to serve the aristocracy. That's how they made their living, and they were finding that increasingly difficult in revolutionary France.
Yeah, I've always wondered, because you don't really see a return to. Uh, this is a period of austerity in the economy, in the culture, and society everywhere, and you don't really see that return to decadence until quite a bit later. And I've always wondered if that was partially, some of that was just surely that people with wealth and power, a certain proportion of them will always want to flaunt it. Um, but I've always wondered if some of that was pragmatic, just the luxury goods, service, upkeep of estates and great houses were a huge part of the economy of France in this period. And it's interesting, that you know some of this was like I said, people showing off, but I do wonder if there was maybe a little bit of a patriotic motivation there too, get the economy going again.
I mean, certainly what I would say is that, you know, Jacobins in particular, there was a real view about kind of national workshops and national industries and how do we create jobs for the poor and the like. What I You do also have instances of members of the wealthy directly intervening in local economies to help the poor and to kind of keep the local economy going. So not actually quite your example of, spending on luxury goods, but actually in Toulon, as the revolution breaks out, you have a situation where the government, because it's facing a bankruptcy crisis, is months behind in the paychecks for the arsenal workers that are working in Toulon. And the arsenal, I mean, if you think Lyon is dependent on silk, well, in Toulon, even in peacetime, you're looking at maybe 50% of the popular classes are employed through the naval arsenal in Toulon. And so, in this instance, where you've got high bread prices and a range of other factors, and the government is months behind pay, you do actually see some members of the elite stepping forward to provide essentially an advance to the municipality to help pay these paychecks as well as step up their charitable efforts. So I definitely think that there are some things like that happening at this period of time. But whether you're getting your carriage refitted to help the local economy, I'm not quite sure if it'd be thought of in quite those terms.
So we've talked a lot about the sort of slow ratcheting up of tensions, but let's move on to talk about the actual outbreak of civil war, in particular in Western France in a region called the Vendée.
Yeah, so I suppose to paint the scene, in March 1793, France is facing all sorts of problems, and by now it's at war with most of Europe. As I said, Russia is not an enemy at this point in time. It's busy with the second partition of Poland, but every other great power is involved in the conflict by the end of March 1793. And during this period of time, one of the big issues that the French have is manpower, and they not only have this issue in their officer corps, but in the army more broadly. I mean, they are trying to fight on fronts in essentially modern day Belgium, the Rhineland, in the Western Alps, and along the Spanish border. And that's not including wherever the British decide that they might land some troops as well. And so what we see is recruitment efforts across France. And as a result, we see recruitment riots across France. We see them in Brittany, Normandy, Burgundy, just to name a few. But in the Vendée, we get no ordinary recruitment riot. We get a level of violence which is extreme. And it not only targets the recruiters, but really anyone involved in the administration of the Republican government. Tax collectors, constitutional clergy, so those members of the clergy that had sworn allegiance to the Constitution and the reforms of the Revolutionary era, all sorts of administrators, they were all fair game in this insurrection. And so that's really the trigger, is these recruitment efforts in the Vendée. But as I said, these recruitment riots happen elsewhere, and we don't get a fully fledged uprising that results in a self declared royalist and Catholic army. And so, to get to the bottom of that, you need to get into causes. And one cause that I would say is probably the most commonly known of the Vendean insurrection is religious tensions. And this is a region that is deeply Catholic. I mean, this was a part of France that had experienced missionary work in the wake of France's wars of religion. And so the commitment to Catholicism here is deeply held, and it has a huge impact on the uprising. To give you a flavor of just how resistant this region was to the quite controversial religious reforms of the revolution, priests were required to swear an oath to the constitution and agree to these controversial reforms. And in the diocese of Nantes, you're looking at perhaps 15% of priests swearing the oath. And that's before you factor in those who would later recant when the Pope's opposition became known. And so what you have here is a huge amount of societal tensions between pious peasants who want to keep their true priests and local administrators who want to force upon these communities these constitutional clergy, or intruders, as the villagers like to call them. And what you have here is a situation that, well, at times it can be quite comical. I mean, there's all I can list a bunch of rather funny and amusing examples of how communities resist these unwanted clerics, including, accidentally forgetting the keys to the church. But it also, yeah, I mean, one of my favorites is you had a constitutional cleric that was obviously unwanted in town, and so there was a few women that would shadow him with brooms, and every time he walked somewhere, they would sweep away his footprints to erase any evidence of this existence of this heretical cleric. And I mean, there's a lots of really funny examples. There's also, of course, lots of violent examples of priests being sent in essentially with the National Guard and forced upon these communities. And as the revolution radicalizes, you start to get things like priest hunts, and you essentially get the establishment of an underground church where you have secret mass being held in barns and woods and caves and the like. And so you can imagine the kind of tension that's existing in this environment. And this is alongside the fact that church property has been nationalized and is being sold off. And this has very real consequences for people's everyday life that I think us, in the 21st century, we live in more secular societies, we might not think of. Even before the outbreak of violence in Western France, you see weddings in some of these regions drop by 90%. People are concerned that their loved ones can't get legitimate baptisms, legitimate funerals, and these are no laughing matters for people of deeply held religious beliefs. And so obviously religious tensions are a big factor here, and it's the most famous factor, but it isn't the only one either. And historians, if you get into the historiography, start to bitterly disagree over just what is the biggest factor here. Because if you look at the Vendée, it's true to say that yes, there is a high proportion of non-constitutional clergy, but that's actually true elsewhere in France as well. And so you get some historians that look towards, to a lesser extent, the terrain, but in particular the urban-rural divide and start to see the Vendean uprising not so much as a religious revolt, but perhaps something more akin to a peasant revolt, which I can get
Yeah,
into if you like.
that's something that blew me away when I was researching the Vendée Rebellion. Is that there was no town, there was one town in the Vendée with more than 5,000 people, and it was not much more than 5,000 people. So that's I mean, when you talk about a rural society, that's an almost entirely rural society. I mean, quite literally, there is barely anyone living in a settlement bigger than a small village.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the terrain alone has two considerable impacts on this rebellion. One is that, as you say, this is a very sparsely populated region. There's a big distances between the urban centres, and it's a landscape that's characterized by high hedges, narrow roads, woods, hills, etc. This is perfect for guerrilla warfare. This is a terrain that is disorientating, it's isolating, it's hugely advantageous for those that are fighting on their home turf. And this gives the rebels in the initial months a huge advantage against revolutionary authorities who are attempting to subdue the rebellion and are essentially outsiders to this region. The terrain also, it is worth noting, it actually helps to explain why religion is such an important part of people's lives in this part of
Yes.
France, because people are living incredibly isolated lifestyles. They're on very secluded farms and hamlets. And it's on Sunday that these families come together. The church is the common thread. It's not only the spiritual home of the community, but it is the home for the community more broadly. And so, yes, local priests are doing things like giving their religious services, but they're also providing services around marriages, burials, baptisms, in some cases, educational or charitable activities. And the priests are maybe one of the few individuals that are literate and are considered quite wise and learned and the like. And so local priests are often being consulted on other matters as well. And so the unique terrain of the Vendée and the region around it, it not only makes it, it's not only perfect for guerrilla warfare, but it actually helps to reinforce why religion is so important to the inhabitants of this part of France that might not be the case elsewhere in the nation.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And of course, there's also the flip side of that coin, where because of the terrain and the social structure make the church so powerful. It also, the flip side of that coin, the state is extremely distant. And so when the revolutionaries step in and say, forget about the church, we're going to come in, and the state is going to undertake many of the functions that you would have once, looked to the church for, in a place where the state is that distant and that uninvolved in daily life. That seems like a crazy proposition. If you're in Paris and you see the power of the state kind of, and civil society sort of growing around you, that might seem like a very natural thing. Jettison this archaic institution. But when you're living in a place like the Vendée, the idea that a bunch of bureaucrats and middle class people from the city are going to just take over from the church is just insanity. Setting aside the issues of personal faith, just on a practical level, that doesn't seem like a very good idea. If you're in one of these rural, isolated places where Catholicism is so strong.
And not only that, but you've got a position in the Vendée where the gifts that this increased state is bringing aren't actually that many. I think one of the things that it's important to note in the Vendée is that the rural third estate here in this part of France didn't see the same benefits as members of the rural third estate elsewhere. And part of the reason for that is that the peasants in the Vendée, including many better off peasants, were renters on long-term tenancies, and the actual land was owned by generally the bourgeoisie in the urban communities. And so what this meant is when the state arrived, not only were church assets being nationalized, not only were their local and well-respected priests soon to be villainized, but actually because of the reforms of the revolution, they're starting to see rents increase. They don't see the benefit of the abolition of privileges. Those benefits are going essentially to landlords who therefore use the absence of the tithe and various other feudal rights to justify hiking rents. It's generally to townspeople that the new officers of the regime are going to as well. There are reforms to how common land is used that are again detrimental to the peasantry. And so, as you say, it's this situation where the state is inserting itself into these people's lives. And it's not bringing really anything positive because even elsewhere in France, where the same reforms were making positive impacts for the peasantry, in the Vendée, because of the unique situation here, it's actually quite often detrimental as well.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I find so fascinating about studying this period is you can trace these things that seem so arcane, like different land tenure systems and different legal systems and different political economies, and these things might seem are who but a scholar could care about these things, but then you look at the way they interact with events, and you can see that really these things are what sort of set the terms of play in all these events. If you ask, a big question like, "Oh, why was the revolution received differently in, pick a place somewhere in central France as opposed to the Vendée?" You know, it does come down to these sort of off the beaten path questions like land tenure. Very interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not only true with the Vendée. I mean, as I said at the start of this collaboration, we're currently exploring the Federalist revolts. And if you go look at the situation in, say, Lyon, for example, you will have individuals that are essentially sans-culottes, artisans, and the like, that you would expect to be backing local Jacobins. And there, many are apathetic or actually backing the very broad anti Jacobin coalition. And it comes down to, if you get into the weeds, it comes down to all sorts of unique economic incentives and social incentives and the like, and various ways that ideologies and interpersonal issues, geographic issues, etc. And one of the things that's really advantageous about going and having a look at how the revolution plays out in these communities outside of Paris is that it kind of challenges what you think is the norm, which is generally the kind of Parisian centric narrative around the revolution. And you can kind of see how, as you say, things that you might think are so boring or so mundane, or is that even really relevant, actually, when it comes together with some other factors, can really change the way that, like you're putting pretty similar ingredients into the cake, but when it comes out, it's something completely different. And I think,
Right.
you overlook these finer points at your peril. So obviously, though, you get this conflict in the Vendée. You get these conflicts that break out in 1793 with the Federalist revolts, and you see off the back of the purging of the Girondins, more than 60, well, roughly 60 departments protest, and about a dozen engage in prolonged insurrection. From there, you get the names that we kind of associate with maybe aspects of the Terror and Napoleon's rise, like Toulon and Lyon, and to lesser extents, Marseille and Bordeaux and the like. But, we started this episode talking about Napoleon and, in particular, his life and his connections in Corsica. And Corsica, while not part of the Federalist revolts and certainly not part of the Vendée uprising either, does have a very unique history in terms of its break and essentially rebellion with Paris. Are you able to take us back to 1793 Corsica with its tensions and its divisions, and I suppose the unique characteristics of this formerly independent island, and kind of elaborate on what 1793 looks like in the Mediterranean?
Sure. Many of the same tensions we've been talking about exist also on Corsica. Obviously, Corsica is not the Vendée. Very different society, very different history, but there are some similarities. Corsica is a place like the Vendée where the church is very connected to the population. Something they both have in common is that the priests, the local parish priests tend to come from the area. And so very often the person in charge of the local church is a bright young man from the community who was lucky enough to get some scholarship to go study to be a priest and then came back to, roughly where the region he was from and is now sort of the leader of the flock. And so that's very different than having a priest who's an outsider. The church in Corsica was very poor. And so in other parts of France, you have this dynamic where people resent that there's so much poverty and injustice in the society, and yet these priests are living high on the hog. Well, that's not really true in Corsica. In Corsica, the priests are as poor as the people they minister to. And so Corsica is a very devout place. I mean, this is a very devout era, but even by the standards of the 1790s Europe, Corsica is extremely Catholic. And it's also very rural. It's just not, the soil in Corsica is pretty poor. There's not much large scale agriculture going on. It's a society of herders mostly. And the traditional clan system is very strong. There's, this idea, it's funny to think of Enlightenment people at the dawn of the 19th century talking about their clan chiefs. But that was very much a part of life in Corsica. And actually, during his time in power, Paoli had actually entrenched that system. He did reform it a bit in his defense, but that's an area where his regime was quite conservative, where they were actually shoring up this very ancient system of authority. So you've got tensions growing just like they are in the mainland, where as the government is becoming more assertive and more radical and more anti-clerical, people are turning against it. One of my favorite anecdotes from this period is Napoleon and his brother are out walking in Ajaccio, their hometown, on a Catholic holy day. And they had just recently published a pamphlet attacking the church. And they have the bad luck on this day to walk past a procession of Catholic penitents. And someone in the crowd recognizes them and says, "Hey, aren't those the guys who wrote that horrible, blasphemous pamphlet attacking the church?" And all of a sudden, this holy procession starts to look more like a lynch mob. And things are only stopped when a famous local bandit says, "I'll kill anyone who puts a finger on the Bonaparte brothers." Very dramatic, but it goes to show you that things are, in a sense, not so different from the stories you were telling of these unwanted priests in the Vendée. There's increasingly intense social pressure from Catholics to make this stop. And of course, the revolutionaries don't want to stop. They are convinced that, in fact, much more needs to be done. And so there's that growing tension. There's also the sort of legal warfare between the factions is growing. There's they're launching dueling investigations of each other. The Jacobin clubs in southern France are increasingly host to Corsican radicals who denounce Paoli and denounce his administration. Lucien Bonaparte is one of these people, actually. And he gave a speech. I should mention he's a teenager at this point, which is pretty impressive. He gives a speech to a Jacobin club in southern France that is so incendiary and so anti-Paoli that it leads to a formal break between Paoli and the Bonapartes, which would ultimately lead in him declaring them outlaws. So things are coming to a head in the spring of 1793. Paoli finally makes the first move, sends out his partisans to seize strategic locations around the island, and the fighting begins. Napoleon and Salicetti actually launch an attack on Ajaccio. They sort of gather together loyalists who have left the city to go hide out in the countryside because the city has been taken by the Paolisti. And Napoleon and his patron Salicetti lead this sort of doomed last throw of the dice to try to retake the city from the Paolisti, and they fail. And Napoleon goes to exile in France and never returns home. But the fighting continues on Corsica actually for quite some time. There's a sort of renegade Corsican nobleman who leads the remnants of the Republican forces on the island and actually achieves some surprising success. But unfortunately for the Corsican Jacobins, Paoli, who was a long term committed Anglophile after his long exile in Britain, has turned to the British and brought a Royal Navy squadron to Corsica, including a young captain named Horatio Nelson. And the British and the Paolisti forces are able to snuff out this last Republican resistance, and Paoli declares a new Corsican kingdom with King George III as its king. So Corsica has been firmly moved into the counter-revolutionary camp.
It's absolutely fascinating, the story of Corsica, as someone who knows a little bit about the Corsican Revolution as well. It's a wild ride that, 5 decades or so. One of the things that I find humorous is earlier this episode you mentioned how there were people that were moving towards the kind of royalist regime that previously wouldn't have thought that they would move towards that column, if you like. I wonder how many in the initial years of the revolution thought that they would end up as a British protectorate of all things. It seems an unlikely ending. I suppose, of course, this is not the ending, and it's certainly not the end for our chief protagonist. How does Napoleon respond to these events, and how does he find himself just months later at the walls of Toulon?
Well, after the failure of this sort of last ditch attack on Ajaccio, he has this very harrowing experience where, essentially the survivors of this attack essentially say, "Well, I guess we got to get back to France." They all go their separate ways and say good luck. Napoleon knows that his brother is in Calvi in the north of the island and is preparing to take the family to France. But Calvi is on the other side of the island, and Napoleon has to walk there, and he's been declared an outlaw, and there's fighting going on all over the island, and the Paolisti forces are in charge of the countryside. So he has this journey across Corsica, which must have been, he was very lucky that he ran into some shepherds who were members of his family's clan. And so these shepherds, when they approach him, he doesn't know who they are, and that must have been a heart in your throat moment. But they turns out that they are actually uh, want to swear allegiance to him and offer to do anything that they can to help him. And these men basically walk him to Calvi. He was so moved by this that he actually mentioned all of them by name in his will and gave them a substantial sum of money for saving him all those years ago. Then from Calvi, Napoleon being Napoleon, always thorough, he writes a report to the government in Paris on what has gone on. And then the family gets on a boat and leaves Corsica, and most of them never return. And then they are refugees in France. And I think it's interesting that there is, you mentioned that, the aid to the refugees in London had a very modern feel to it. And in southern France, there's a similar phenomenon with the refugees from Corsica. These Republican patriots, they called themselves, who had been dispossessed and forced out of their homeland. And the government actually has programs to help them. And the Bonapartes are able to sort of go on welfare because they are refugees um, who suffered in the name of the government. And they get sort of menial jobs, which probably things that before the revolution they never imagined they would be doing. The women of the family are like doing laundry and seamstress work, and Napoleon is able to get back into the French army, who had actually put him on the inactive rolls. He was on the same list of officers as all the emigres because he had been away from the army for so long, involving himself in these Corsican political squabbles. And he gets a thankless and extremely junior position in the army, but as they say, the rest is history.
Absolutely, and maybe that's where we'll leave it for our listeners. But it is absolutely fascinating, even just his story of getting out of Corsica. I mean, for those people that aren't aware, Corsica is the most mountainous island in the Mediterranean. The ancient Romans more or less just left the interior of the island alone; just wasn't worth their time. It would have been quite an ordeal getting off Corsica, to say the least. I suppose, Everett, before we wrap up, do you want to maybe introduce the Age of Napoleon to my listeners and just explain what you're doing over there?
Yeah, so it does what it says on the box. I'm going through Napoleon's life at a snail's pace. I'm actually writing episode 113 now, and we've only gotten to 1808. So, I'm going. Well, people who listen to your show expect a level of detail and rigor, and I think I'm bringing the same thing to Napoleon's story. So if you're interested in a sort of a different vantage point on these events and a narrative that sort of is more focused on the later part of this story, um, I think you guys might enjoy my show.
I regularly find myself recommending The Age of Napoleon. I'm an avid listener myself, and I think it's definitely a similar level of detail. I mean, we're 70 episodes in and only in 1793, but I think you get a really good sense of where things are heading, and they're quite complementary.
Yeah, it's funny. I all the time I get listeners. The French Revolution is like one of a popular period of my show, and I sometimes get people who want me to revisit those topics, and it's like there's plenty of other people doing doing that if that's what you're looking for. So I always recommend your show to people who wish for more detail on those events.
Yeah, for those that are interested in something more detailed on the French Revolution, Grey History, spelt Grey, we're exploring essentially the ambiguities and nuances of the French Rev with a real focus on historiography, but it's a very similar format to the Age of Napoleon. And we're currently doing about 10 or so episodes on the Federalist revolts of 1793, looking at the various regional centres, and we're going to do 4 episodes on Toulon, not just the siege, but also looking at the experience of Toulon since 1789, and also the state of the First Coalition and the Second Partition of Poland and Anglo-Spanish relations, and how all these factors will influence the siege. And yeah, later this year we'll have everything from Marie Antoinette's trial to the assassination of Jean Paul Marat. So if you're looking for something that really gets into the detail, check out Grey History, the French Revolution. Thank you for listening to this special collaboration episode with the Age of Napoleon podcast. Everett and I had a blast recording this episode, and I hope you enjoyed it too. If you're interested in Corsican history or just can't wait for the next episode on Toulon, then why not support the show and join the Grey History community? Finally, if you've enjoyed hearing Everett talk about all things Napoleon, then why not check out the Age of Napoleon podcast? It's a personal favourite show of mine, and with more than 100 episodes on the Napoleonic era, there's plenty to sink your teeth into. Anyway, that's enough from me, so thank you for listening, stay safe, and have a great day.